Hello everyone, welcome to the channel, and I'm here for a ranking video for you guys. Now for this ranking, I'll be ranking the decades of rock music. Now this is a video idea that I've recently thought about doing since I've done this for metal. I've ranked all the decades of metal on this channel before, and I still stand by my ranking for metal for the most part, so figured why not do one for rock music. Now, rock music started all the way back in the 50s, at least according to a Google search. So yeah, that's how far back we'll be going with this ranking. So we're going to go and rank the decades of rock from the 50s to the 2010s. Of course, we're not going to include 2020s because, well, we're still new to the decade, of course. But we're going to go from worst to best. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First decade at the bottom, I gotta go with the 2010s. Now, this one might not come off as a shock to some people. Some people might already know that the 2010s is probably my least favorite decade of rock music. And this is really the decade where I feel like rock music has really took a downturn, I guess you could say. A lot of rock bands in the 2010s either sound a little too overproduced or they just layer their sound with electronics, and it's just not good. It's barely even rock music anymore. You know, it's basically pop rock is basically what the majority of 2010s bands in rock are. Now, that doesn't go for all bands, but I think the majority of them, that's something that definitely could apply to them. So now the 2010s, I think some people actually don't mind this whole electronic idea when it comes to rock music. I think there's a lot of millennials especially that welcome this idea because they think it sounds cool and it sounds epic and futuristic and, you know, all this and that. But to me, it's not very good. On top of all of that, the vocals honestly don't sound much different from typical boy band vocals. You already know what band I'm kind of nodding at here. Starset, of course, a band that basically sounds like a boy band, if I'm being perfectly honest. Yeah. So 2010s, I think it's easily the weakest decade of rock music. Next, we got to talk about the 1950s. Now, I don't really know many bands from the 50s when it comes to rock, but the reason that I have the 50s where it is in my ranking, you know, at least above the 2010s, is because I can at least respect this era, because obviously the 2010s hasn't really meant anything to rock music, unlike the 50s. I mean, if, you know, rock started in the 50s, then yeah, I just have a little more appreciation for it, even though I'm not really into any bands of the 50s. Now, next, I want to talk about the 90s. Now, the 90s, this is really where grunge kind of was taking the spotlight, I think, you know, and that's why, you know, metal has kind of, you know, kind of gone under the rug a little bit, I guess you could say, because, well, grunge has kind of, you know, skyrocketed, I guess, in the 90s, and, I mean, I think the reason I have the 90s rather low in this ranking is because it's just because of the grunge movement. Now, I think grunge is an interesting genre. I mean, I don't hate grunge. I actually don't mind some grunge. I mean, I think Alice in Chains is a very good band. Now, I think grunge is considered a style of rock. Like, I think if you were to ask me if it's more rock or metal, then yeah, I'd say it's rock. But yeah, I mean, once again, the reason that the 90s is where it is in my ranking is because of the grunge movement. This was a very big time for grunge, which is not a bad thing, but grunge can be hit or miss for me, honestly. Like, I'm not really into a lot of it, but I can't say that I mind it or anything. So 90s, that's what's coming next. Now, the next decade I want to talk about is the 2000s. Yes, that's right. I have the 2000s in front of the 90s and the 50s, believe it or not. But yeah, 2000s, the reason that, you know, I think it's better for me personally than the 90s and even the 50s is because Of course, some really great bands formed. Of course, Red. Red is one of my favorite modern rock bands. Breaking Benjamin. I mean, this is when Breaking Benjamin came to the scene. Also had 3 Days Grace, another really great band. Yeah, these 3 bands in particular are really the reason why the 2000s is placed where it is. A lot of my nostalgia bands come from the 2000s, like I said, with bands like Red, Breaking Benjamin, and 3 Days Grace. These are great bands on their own, so the 2000s, pretty solid decade of rock, I'd say. Not too bad. Like I said, I think it's better than the 90s, the 50s, and obviously better than the 2010s. So next, we got the 1960s. Now, some of you might be rather surprised that I have the 1960s this high in my ranking, above the 2000s and the 90s especially. But I'll tell you why. Because this is when a lot of great bands started coming around, specifically Led Zeppelin and Yes. These 2 bands in particular are hands down enough for me to put the 60s where it is on my ranking, of course. Now, I believe this is also when the Beatles first came around. Now, I'm not a Beatles fan, but I do respect them, and, you know, I respect their contribution to rock music. And interesting enough that I found something that I found out about the Beatles was they didn't really, their career really only lasted about 10 years or something like that, which is kind of surprising given how big they are. But yeah, the Beatles, while I'm not the biggest fan of them, I do respect them. But Led Zeppelin, of course, great band. Their debut came out in the 60s, the very late 60s. And the debut Led Zeppelin album is my favorite of Led Zeppelin's discography. You also had Yes come out with their debut album, and Yes is, well, of course, one of the pioneers of progressive music. And their debut, it was pretty good, but it wasn't one of their best. So yeah, that's why I have the 60s where it is on my ranking, of course. Now next, we got the 1980s. Now, the 1980s, the reason I have this decade of rock this high in my ranking at number 2 is because, well, a lot of my favorite bands have started putting out some of their best work at this decade. This is where rock started becoming a little more accessible as well. You know, a lot more mainstream, of course, you know, a lot, you know, more poppy, you know, which I, you know, don't hate too much, you know. Now, the whole poppy thing, I'm not saying that, you know, to insult this decade, obviously, you know, the cheesiness of the 80s sound, I guess, is a better way to describe it. I mean, I actually like that stuff. I think it's really cool stuff, but yeah. Now, when it comes to the bands that have formed in the 80s, I can't say that I'm really a fan of many bands that have formed in the 80s or didn't start releasing music till the 80s. Now, there is Def Leppard. Def Leppard is definitely one of the big reasons why the 80s time is this high in my ranking, of course. Def Leppard is a really great band. This is also when you had some of Van Halen's best albums, like Fair Warning. You also had Rush with Moving Pictures, which is one of my favorite albums of all time. You also had Yes come out with some great albums like 90125. There's just been a lot of solid material in the 80s time from bands that have been around longer than the 80s. But like I said, there's not many bands that I can think of that I'm a fan of that have formed in the 80s. That's all. But nothing against those bands, obviously. I can respect them. But the 80s, I'd say it's one of the best times for rock music. Now, even though I thought the 1980s was a really great time for rock music, it still pales in comparison to my number 1 pick for what I believe is the best decade of rock music. My number 1 pick is the 1970s. In my opinion, there's not a decade that could beat this era when it comes to rock music. Not only did you have some of the greatest bands in the world start coming around at this time, but I mean, the bands have also put out some of their best material. I mean, some of my favorite albums in the world, are from the 70s. I mean, this is when you had Rush come around. I mean, come on, for crying out loud, Rush. The 70s is where Rush came from. So, hands down, Rush is, a good enough reason to say that the 70s is the best time for rock music. I mean, I am kind of a biased fan when it comes to Rush because they are one of my favorite bands. But you also had other great bands like Genesis, another great progressive rock band, and Van Halen. Now, Van Halen put out their first album in the late 70s, but still counts as the 70s, obviously. Aerosmith, some of Aerosmith's best work came from the 70s, such as Rocks. But yeah, the 70s, hands down, I think it's the best time for rock music. You also had Yes come out with some of their best material, like Close to the Edge and Fragile. I just love the 70s era of rock music, and it's easily the best in my opinion. So there you have it. That is my ranking for the decades of rock music, ranked worst to best. Let me know what you think. How would you personally rank the decades of rock music? Feel free to let me know in the comments. So with that being said, thanks for watching, have a nice day, and take care.